She left all this for this. An all-American honors student on a courageous journey to a land of revolution and unmarked graves.
I told her often enough that, Amy, you do things that I would never do. I wouldn't go in there.
She came to fight racism, but died for the color of her skin.
She was truly part of us, and she didn't deserve to die like she did.
It's a country where 16,000 gave their lives.
Amy was 16,001.
Tonight, her family's emotional journey to a world they never knew.
I now know what it feels like to be hated surely because of race.
To make a difficult decision.
You kind of lose the anger and it just turns to sadness.
And discover a daughter they never imagined.
I was in awe of my daughter, how she affected people halfway around the world and how they were celebrating her life.
The inspiring story of Amy Biehl. Good evening, I'm Diane Sawyer. Amy Biehl was like a lot of young women you may know, smart, vibrant, with a terrific sense of humor. But from the time she was in high school, she developed a passion that would eventually carry her halfway around the world to fight and die for freedom. 3 years ago, when we first broadcast this program, her parents were just beginning to cope with her tragic death, learning about a daughter they never knew and the country that inspired her. Last month, they returned to South Africa to do something I'm not sure many parents in the same situation could do. I'll tell you about the amazing decision they made later. But first, Don Cladstrup has the inspiring story of Amy Biehl, a story that began just as South Africa was emerging from decades of oppression.
Good evening. The brutal murder of American exchange student Amy Biehl in Gugulethu near Cape Town last night has been condemned across the political spectrum.
Meanwhile, 2 PASU members have been arrested in connection with the murder of Miss Biehl, who had a high profile among organizations struggling for an emerging democracy in South Africa.
She was only 26. She had gone to South Africa because she wanted to help.
Amy Elizabeth Biehl was born April 26, 1967. That's not very long ago, is it? She's survived by Linda and Peter, her parents, Kimberly, her sister, Molly, her sister, and Zachary, her brother.
Molly got the news first.
The State Department called me at my office, and having this woman say, well, something bad has happened, are you sitting down? And I said, is she dead? Yes, she's dead. What happened?
It happened along this road, in the black township of Gugulethu, when a mob of 30 youths attacked Amy as she was driving 3 friends home. The group began throwing stones, shattering her windshield. Amy jumped from her car, ran toward this gas station, but the mob caught her. They bludgeoned her with bricks, and then stabbed her to death. Her father, Peter, thinks about it every day.
There are many horrible ways to die, but that has to be among the most frightening. It kills me, tears me up that she had to go that way.
Murdered only 2 days before she was due to leave South Africa, where she had been working as a Fulbright scholar.
I was going to ask Amy to marry me today. I don't regret not having asked her before. The time was never right before. In the last letter that she wrote to me, she told me 1 year isn't so long in the big picture. How could we have known? How could I have known?
But Amy knew there was danger. She was acutely aware that behind the breathtaking beauty of this land is another picture, one not so pretty, one filled with pain and despair. This is the South Africa that moved Amy most, touched her, inspired her, before she was killed.
Amy's friends and colleagues also know that behind her beautiful face and inside her beautiful little body was the heart of a warrior.
As condemnation of the mob killing of Amy Biehl poured in this afternoon, at least 10 more people were killed in violent incidents around the country. KwaZulu police reported 2 people shot dead at Umlazi, while at eZekheni, the ANC reported 4 people killed when gunmen opened fire on residents.
Newport Beach, California, Amy Biehl's hometown. Take a good look. What a contrast to the poverty of South Africa, to squatter camps, to people clamoring for justice, people struggling for survival. Yet this is where Amy Biehl started to think about those things. And once she did, her sister Kim says there was no stopping her.
She was completely determined to do what she wanted to do. Complete determination from the youngest age.
In nursery school, Amy stubbornly refused to remove her mask after meeting the Lone Ranger. In elementary school, she wrote a speech asking why a woman shouldn't be president of the United States. In high school, even though she was scared of heights, she became a champion diver. In college, according to her best friend Katie O'Brien, while Amy was a serious student, she didn't always take herself seriously.
She loved to make a fool of herself, too. We used to go out and we'd kind of accost people on stage and take over the mic and just start singing and be wild and loud and just having a great time.
We'd like to dedicate this to Katie O'Brien because we can't describe our feelings at the moment, but rather yet we'd like to sing them.
At Katie's wedding party, Amy struck just the right note. You might not think that a girl growing up in a typical, comfortable, upper-middle-class neighborhood would be especially interested in South Africa. And Amy wasn't. Until one day, in high school, she heard a song on the radio. It was a song about South Africa's most prominent black leader, Nelson Mandela, whose fight for racial justice cost him 27 years in prison. Until she heard those words, Amy barely knew who Nelson Mandela was. Her mother says he became her hero.
I think that Nelson Mandela's story, his life, lifted her into another world.
On the basis of one man, one vote.
It was all she thought about, talked about, and that affected the whole family, including her younger brother, Zach.
Having Amy as a sister, I've always been involved in South Africa. I've done reports on Mandela since 5th grade.
Her family got used to Amy writing Free Mandela on all the cards and letters she sent from college. She even wrote it on her graduation cap. At Stanford University, Amy's interest in South Africa really grew.
I think set a pattern that had
She was one of the few whites in Professor Jackson's African Studies class, but that wasn't the only reason people noticed her.
Into these upper class.
The thing that really astonished me about her was her willingness to try to arrange a student dialogue. So just her spirit and her ability to do this was something that I had to stand back and sort of I used to marvel at. And I used to go to class expecting that she would come with stuff.
She became fascinated with South African politics, absorbed with the country's history. A history that began more than 300 years ago when the first white settlers arrived from Holland. They called themselves Afrikaners, the white tribe of Africa, people who believed they had a God-given right to a land of their own, even if that land belonged to someone else. In some ways, it resembled the settling of the American West, complete with circled wagons and battles against native inhabitants. Though vastly outnumbered, the Afrikaners managed to subdue native tribes. In 1948, to assure their survival and control over the country's wealth, South Africa's white rulers imposed an ugly system of oppression called apartheid. They stripped blacks of their rights, bulldozed them from their homes and pushed them into artificially created townships and tribal homelands. Blacks were not allowed to hold certain jobs, not allowed to travel freely, not allowed to be educated for anything except performing menial tasks. In 1976, the United Nations called apartheid a crime against humanity.
As time goes on,
14 years later, it became something Amy Biehl wanted to change.
She didn't wear rose-colored glasses, you know. But she did want a better world. And she was prepared to take risks to make a better world.
In 1990, Amy got her first full-time job working for the National Democratic Institute in Washington, D.C. She was sent to several African countries where she helped set up elections and register people to vote. 2 years later, Amy was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study politics in South Africa. She enrolled at the University of the Western Cape near Cape Town. She told her sister Molly things were going well.
Socially and culturally, I adjusted very well. I can now speak elementary Xhosa and a bit of Zulu. I have a wide range of friends.
But Amy was stunned by the terrible poverty in black townships. I saw people drawing water, she wrote in her journal, just trying to get by. Amy's frequent trips into black townships worried one of her teachers.
I told her often enough, Amy, you do things that I would never do. She would go into the township, she would go clubbing with them, she would go partying with them. And I mean, every day I would warn her and say, Amy, you know, I wouldn't go in there. And she'd dismiss me as a nagging old woman, you know. The Amy Biehl file.
At the end of her 10-month scholarship, just before her flight home, Amy told Professor Kadali she was surprised nothing bad had happened to her, because she'd had a premonition something would.
She said it Sunday, she said it Monday, and she said it 2 hours to me before she died.
Amy said goodbye to Rhoda. At about 5, another friend, Malasatsi Maseba, called Amy to ask for a ride home.
Every time, I just have that picture of that day.
It would take Amy miles out of her way to the black township of Guguletu where Malasatsi lived. Normally, it's a quiet township. Violence is rare. Earlier that day, however, young radicals held a small rally, like this one. One settler, one bullet, the slogan of the Pan-Africanist Congress, a small black extremist organization which regards whites in South Africa as oppressors. As Amy turned onto Guguletu's main street, some of the demonstrators spotted her, saw her white skin, a settler. Seconds later, a hail of rocks and bricks hit Amy's car.
Everyone was calling Amy, Amy, drive, Amy. But Amy just, last heard her saying, I can't. And she never said anything again.
They jumped from the car and began running.
You pleaded with her killers not to harm her.
I did.
Didn't they understand?
Just chase us like wild animals.
The mob trapped Amy against this fence near a gas station. Then they stabbed her to death.
They said also she deserved to die because she's a settler. So they kill Amy because she's a white person.
And it didn't matter to them what she stood for or what kind of a person she was?
Definitely didn't, because they killed her.
In Cape Town today, South Africans, white and black, joined in condemning the murder of an American student.
Amy's murder made headlines all over the world.
Nelson Mandela's African National Congress condemned the attack and promised to use its influence in the township to help police solve the crime.
She was truly part of us, you know, and she didn't deserve to die. Worse still, she didn't deserve to die like she did. There were many people like myself who felt guilty. Guilty being black.
Today, that smile of Amy is no more. That lively face of Amy is no more. It is because of the love for you and me that have caused Amy's life today. I'm feeling very disturbed.
Although incomplete in this life,
12,000 miles away, Amy's family struggled to make sense of their daughter's murder.
Well, I don't know how terrific it's going to be, David, but let's put it this way. It's something we have to get
Take a
behind
diary
us.
or a notebook or something.
The way to do that, they decided, was to go to South Africa, see the country that so inspired their daughter, and try to understand the reasons why she was killed.
You think the South African press is going to be a problem? If I didn't face the challenge of her death, and if I went upstairs and buried myself in my pillow or whatever, she would have thought I was a quitter.
And she wasn't, was she?
No. You can't let Amy down. She didn't like that. She leads us on. She's not gone in many ways. Physically, she's not here, but the spirit, her personality, her sense of who she was, it leads us on.
The shock of Amy Biehl's death and the outpouring of sympathy from around the world propelled her family into the chaos of South Africa's revolution. It was 1994 and free elections had not yet been held. Don Cladstrup picks up the story.
Cape Town, South Africa, half a world away from Newport Beach, light years from nearly everything they had ever known.
Eric Hagan, how are you?
The murder of Amy Biehl was not just a tragedy, it was a political embarrassment, something that wasn't supposed to happen to outsiders, especially those who are white.
The Biehls are here, therefore, for us to pay tribute to Amy's life.
The city of Cape Town hoped to deflect any criticism by bringing the Biehls to South Africa.
To show to the world that there is in South Africa a movement towards peace and a movement towards democracy.
Amy had always wanted her family to see that, to experience firsthand the changes that are shaking this country.
I felt it about 10 minutes after we landed, and I began thinking, I have never in my life been in the middle of a revolution. You get quite a rush. The fact that they are in all probability going to turn an entire country upside down.
A revolution that's been going on for some time. 1976. 1986, 1994.
Since the struggle began for liberation in our country, 16,000 people have given their lives. Amy was 16,001.
In Guguletu, the township where Amy Biehl was killed by a mob, hundreds of people turned out to honor her. It was the first of many tributes. Her father, Peter, spoke for the family.
You've made it much easier for us this morning to have counted her among the 16,000. Amy would have been very embarrassed to be singled out for special attention because of what she was, because of what she was involved in.
At the University of the Western Cape, where Amy worked and studied, the Biehls expected another service, more speeches, maybe 25 people. But as Amy's sister Kim soon discovered, it was much more than that.
I remember I was the first to go in, and all these people, wanting to touch us, and I was just blown away.
Amy knew the feeling. The thing I'll remember most, she once said, is the singing of liberation songs. It's absolutely chilling to hear these beautiful songs, which mean so much to the people. While not everyone here knew Amy personally, they knew what she stood for and embraced her family as one of their own. Alan Bosak, a leading political activist.
There are lists of names too long to mention of people who have died in the struggle and families who have lost loved ones. You have today joined that list. Welcome to the struggle family.
3.5 years before Amy was killed, that struggle took a dramatic turn when world criticism and mounting pressure at home forced the government to release Nelson Mandela from prison. It also forced the government to officially put an end to apartheid.
Ladies and gentlemen, today will be written up in our history as one of the most fundamental turning point days in the history of South Africa. Today we have closed the book on apartheid and that chapter.
Maria Kutuani didn't hear those words, but if she had, she would have shaken her head. Long after President de Klerk had announced apartheid was over, Maria's husband, a farm worker, was beaten to death by a white man, simply because their dog mated with his.
Many of these people express their frustration in the only way they can, which is to beat up the nearest black for the smallest reason.
There is no name on the grave of Maria's husband, just a number. That would have bothered Amy Biehl, her mother says.
She always indicated that there were many thousands of black people killed, that you never heard their name mentioned in print or on television, and that white people always got the attention.
Are you angry?
Yes, I'm very angry.
Amy Biehl never met Maria Kutuani, but it was Maria and millions like her who drew Amy to South Africa, who made her realize that while apartheid may be over, it's not dead. It's hard to forget about apartheid, Amy wrote in her journal. I think it's an issue of people living their everyday lives, just trying to survive. For Maria, surviving means having to raise 6 children, having to live in a shack made from scraps of wood and corrugated tin. There's no running water, no electricity, no toilet. Every day, she has to walk 5 miles to the home of Mrs. Finney Collins, where she works as a maid. Her pay, $10 a week. It's a typical black-white relationship. Although apartheid is very visible, Amy wrote, there's constant interaction between blacks and whites.
For 90% of whites, the only contact with black people is master-servant. With their maid, their gardener, and if they go to work, by and large, with a black secretary, perhaps.
I think she's part of my life. A lot of things happen in 16 years, and Miriam knows my family, I know her family. To me, she's like a sister.
If that's true, Maria wonders why Mrs. Collins, after 16 years, still doesn't know her name, still continues to call her Miriam. Well, why don't you tell Mrs. Collins your name is Maria?
As I told them, but they didn't listen to me.
They don't listen?
They didn't listen to me.
Yeah, Miriam. Yeah. They have to laugh sometimes, too.
Even more revealing is that Mr. and Mrs. Collins did nothing to help Maria's husband when he was being beaten.
We were sitting here in the garden.
Just sitting, when Maria's husband, blood streaming from his head, came running into their yard, chased by the man who was beating him. Why didn't you do something?
How do you mean?
Was there anything you could do to prevent what was going on?
No, but they weren't fighting. They weren't fighting at our place. I don't know what happened down at their house. That I didn't see with my own eyes.
The white man who killed Maria's husband didn't go to jail. His punishment? A $600 fine. Do you think it will be different in the new South Africa?
I can't say. It won't be better.
It won't be. In her journal, Amy wrote, I'll remember the victims of apartheid who treat violence and the loss of family as an everyday occurrence. Amy's greatest admiration was for those leading the fight against apartheid. Especially this man, Chris Hani, the most popular black leader after Nelson Mandela.
Amy loved Chris Hani. We had posters of Chris Hani.
She said that he had the ability to galvanize young people, that was his great gift.
We have been in the forefront of that struggle.
More than any other black leader, it was Chris Hani who held sway over South Africa's angry young blacks. He headed the military wing of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress during the years of armed struggle against apartheid. Suddenly, Hani was dead. April 10th, 1993, shot at point-blank range by a white gunman. Overnight, South Africa was rocked by some of the worst violence ever as young blacks sought to avenge Hani's death. Amy Biehl, who'd been in South Africa just 5 months, got anxious phone calls from America. Her sister Molly remembers what Amy said.
People called Amy to see if she felt safe. And Amy said, "My God, who cares about me? Who cares about me?"
Amy continued going into black townships, not realizing perhaps that the climate there was changing drastically. White skin had become a red flag. Black anger was boiling over. That anger had been building since the 1980s, when many of these young people, unable to get jobs, unable to get an education, risked everything and took to the streets to demand an end to apartheid.
30,000 people went into detention without trial. Some languished there for years. They were tortured, they were brutalized. That has its effect. It brutalizes people. They lose their sense of humanity.
And it can turn people into killers, into the kind of mob that chased Amy down and killed her.
Amy Biehl was the classic victim of a situation which she didn't create, and that is that the moods in the township were very angry, and here in this mood of tension was the lone white face, and that lone white face paid that terrible price.
Frankly, in a way, I'm very, very mad at South Africa for what they did, because it took their problems to get Amy down here, and yet, you know, it's their problems that took Amy away, too.
That's what the Biehl family was finally beginning to understand, to make sense of.
Oh my God.
How some of the very people Amy had been trying to help could take her life.
I was just amazed at how those people had to live, just blown away by the poverty and the displacement.
When Amy's brother Zach and sister Kim first set foot in a squatter camp, they were shocked to learn that this is how 8 million blacks live in South Africa. 8 million, which is more than the entire white population.
You have some pals. You're a good babysitter, Zach. They probably had every reason to hate us or to wonder who we were or to be uncomfortable with us, but they just ran up to us and never let go.
In a way, I thought that maybe if they had a good experience with a white person, I mean, those guys, the only experience with white people are pretty negative. If they maybe saw that there's a little difference, maybe that'll make an impact on them.
The Biehls stayed in the squatter camp for about an hour, and as they waved goodbye, something occurred to Amy's mother.
You look at those faces and you think these kids have such potential, but if they don't have a brighter future, they could be the very same people in another 10, 15 years that killed Amy.
This was the most difficult moment. The part of the journey the Biehl family dreaded, driving into the black township of Guguletu to the place where Amy was killed.
Take some flowers.
It wasn't what Amy's sister Molly expected.
For some reason, I thought that I would be there and, I don't know, the wind would be blowing and Amy would I would feel her there.
What Amy's sister Kim felt was anger and a sense of revulsion.
When I saw it, the place, it just made me so sick. You know, seeing the houses that were right across the way was probably the worst, because I kept thinking, how could they just watch that? Just like they were watching us, was the way I imagined them watching my sister being killed.
It was a scene that shocked Amy's father as well.
I had no idea it was such a public place, that it was such essentially a major thoroughfare. My God, why didn't somebody help her?
Rest in peace, Amy, okay?
Their personal pain was practically overwhelmed by hordes of photographers clustered around the fence where Amy was killed, where the family, one by one, said goodbye.
I just hated being there. I didn't want to put flowers on that spot. I didn't want to be there at all.
For Amy's boyfriend, Scott Meinert, approaching that fence was almost unbearable.
The thing that keeps coming back to me, and really came back to me there when I was, the fear. And really trying to get a grip on knowing how afraid I know she was. And I almost feel like I'm going to struggle with that the rest of my life. It's just the powerlessness of not being able to help her get through that kind of fear.
In all, 7 young blacks, including a 15-year-old, were arrested for Amy's murder. Last November, under tight security, they were driven to the Supreme Court building in Cape Town for the start of their trial. Outside, supporters of the defendants sang songs and chanted political slogans. A ritual in stark contrast to the proceedings taking place inside, where detailed testimony was being formally presented. There was one occasion, however, when the proceedings in this courtroom degenerated into grotesque theater. One of Amy's friends, who was with her during the attack, was here on this witness stand. As she described Amy's dying moments, how she struggled to breathe and perhaps speak, there was noise from the back of the court, where friends of the 3 defendants began to snicker and laugh.
That part sets my blood to boiling. It just drives me nuts when I hear about people laughing in the gallery and taunting witnesses.
If one cannot obviously condone this kind of barbaric behavior, one can perhaps at least understand that for people who've been so brutalized, this was a reversal. They grew up in terms of which it was white people beating black people, and now a sense of triumph that a black person has beaten and killed a white person.
That sense of triumph was visible when 3 of the defendants were released after a key witness, citing death threats, refused to testify. The crowd in front of the courthouse didn't seem to care who Amy Biehl was or what she was doing in South Africa. All that mattered to them was that she was white.
Anyone who comes from the ruling class and come and occupy our motherland, regardless of color, if she's serving the interest of the settler minority regime, we recognize him as a settler.
Settler, the township epithet for white oppressor, the name that greeted Amy's mother and sister Molly when they arrived at the courthouse. They came, they said, to lend some dignity to the trial. They also wanted to meet the state prosecutor, Nali Niehaus.
But it's basically eyewitness testimony that this case
Yes.
revolves around.
Well, we have now...
I mean, there are no fingerprints. There are
Nothing. Eyewitnesses and then the 3 confessions, by the way.
You have all the evidence you think you can pull together.
I have 2 children who saw what happened. Their parents have now both refused for them to testify because they say at night people have run around their houses saying that you're next. And one can hardly blame the parent for being afraid to let an 11-year-old boy
And how
testify.
young are these children?
11 and 14.
When Amy's friend, Malasatsi, testified, she too was threatened and had to flee her home in Guguletu.
Ms. Biehl, I know there are many people out there that saw what had happened. They are just too afraid to come and testify.
Each day when they emerged from the courthouse, the Biehls were taunted by demonstrators.
I think it makes me more sad than angry. I think my sister was such an incredible individual, and it does make me sad that they're not recognizing her contribution for them. I now know what it feels like to be hated sheerly because of race.
You know, my first reaction was, bring the guys to me. I like to talk to these guys.
But after visiting South Africa, Zach's feelings began to change.
You kind of lose the anger and it just turns to sadness all of a sudden. I think if I were a black South African if I were in that situation, I think in some ways I feel I might be a bit militant myself.
But the desire for understanding, for putting aside anger and bitterness, was never more evident than when the Biehls met another family who had lost a loved one.
Hi, I'm Linda.
The widow and children of Chris Hani, the slain political leader.
She's a great admirer of your husband, so.
I felt for my wife it was the single most important moment of the entire trip. There was a bond between Limpo Hani and my wife that was, it was so moving and so huge.
Only a few months earlier, this very spot where two families reached out and tried to comfort each other had been the scene of a horrible murder, where a man Amy Biehl so admired was gunned down in his driveway.
Every time I drove into the driveway, I would just get cold, and get scared. You know, and I would imagine Chris lying there because, like you, I didn't have the chance to see his body in the driveway.
But 14-year-old Kwesi was there. Her father had just returned from the store and was getting out of the car when another man came walking up. Before Kwesi realized what was happening, the man raised a gun and fired.
I still think it's basically all my fault in a way that my father...
No, there's no way it's your fault.
It's not your fault.
Then I was in a state of shock. There's nothing to do. I couldn't think straight until afterwards. I couldn't even remember half the numbers I was supposed to dial. I couldn't even remember.
The murder had stunned millions throughout the country, including Amy Biehl.
The day of your father's death, she called home, and she was heartbroken.
I don't think a lot of people really understand why you aren't angry or bitter or don't want to strike back.
You just have to live with it, and if you end up being a bitter person, like my father wouldn't have liked that, and he wouldn't have liked us to be bitter and live in hatred and start hating white people. That doesn't help anything at all. I mean, that's not what he lived for.
When you are bitter, you can't think straight. You can't be constructive. And whoever decided to kill Chris, that was the motive. He wanted our leadership to be bitter. He wanted our leadership to be angry. They can kill all of us, but we'll continue on our peaceful route to democracy.
But how bleak that route must sometimes feel. The murder of Amy Biehl was a reminder, perhaps, that the legacy of apartheid lives on. Most blacks still live in circumstances that are practically subhuman, in conditions which leaders like Tokyo Sequala say will take generations to overcome.
That's why I'm afraid that if we don't adequately address the hopes, fears, and aspirations, the dreams of the people, if we fail on that, their dreams shall be shattered, and everyone shall have an excuse to remember the past, this time with bitterness. God save us.
Amy often told friends that if she were killed here, she did not want special attention. She wanted, she said, to be counted among the thousands who have lost their lives in the struggle against apartheid.
It was all a little bit overwhelming that my daughter had actually done this with her life. I was in awe of my daughter, how she affected people halfway around the world, and how they were celebrating her life.
After her first trip to South Africa, Amy recorded some thoughts in her journal. The last entry reads, "It's kind of scary to think what lies ahead. I just hope I can keep building on these great experiences and find a life in which I can do something meaningful. I am so fortunate to have had the great family, friends, and education that I've been given. I really hope that I can give something back to the world. And here I go."
Last month, Amy Biehl's parents returned to the land where their daughter died. As South Africa tries to put its violent past to rest, a commission has been set up to consider amnesty for politically motivated crimes. And the young men who killed Amy Biehl were about to appear before that commission. I'll tell you about the tough decision now facing the Biehls when we come back. And now the final chapter in the story of a young woman's courage and the extraordinary journey of the heart her mother and father would take. 8 months after Amy Biehl's death, the free election she worked so hard for finally took place, and Nelson Mandela was elected president. How thrilled she would have been to know that her mother and sister were there.
This is my mother.
And they got to meet her hero.
Well, she loved you. She loved your country. So her blood is here along with many others.
4 of the men who participated in the vicious attack that killed Amy were tried and convicted. Each was sentenced to 18 years in prison. But 3 years later, South Africa's new democratic government has set up a commission to consider amnesty if crimes were committed for political reasons, crimes like the murder of Amy Biehl. Last month, Linda and Peter Biehl made the long trip back to South Africa.
Lift up your right hand and say, "So help me God."
To be there when the men who killed their daughter asked to go free.
I ask Amy's parents, Amy's friends, relatives, I ask them to forgive me.
Incredibly, the Biehls seem prepared to do just that.
In the truest sense, it is for the community of South Africa to forgive its own. We cannot, therefore, oppose amnesty if it is granted on the merits.
They found the compassion to reach out to the parents of the young men.
We're parents too, just like you.
And to the people of Gugulethu, where Amy was killed.
It's something I think we can't really tell people about. So maybe it's, people aren't going to totally understand our feelings, but Amy was a part of this. And Amy chose to come here. We always have to remember that. It was her choice. People here didn't always have a choice.
The Biehls are continuing Amy's mission, helping these children and others get things like books and athletic equipment, working for the future of the country Amy loved so much.
I think her legacy continues. It lives through the many friends she made here in South Africa. It's very much alive, and it's going to be for a long, long time.
The South African Commission, which has the power to pardon Amy's killers, is expected to issue its decision this fall.